Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining today's Pillr Presents Security Briefings virtual session. My name is Sia Karamalis, and I'm the Channel Account Manager at Pillr. In today's session, you'll meet Elise Manna-Browne, our Director of Security Services. Elise specializes in crimeware analysis and threat response. And as a former member of HISAC Threat Intelligence Committee, she's worked insider threat and ransomware cases in organizations across industries, including finance, healthcare, manufacturing, retail, and more. Today, she's going to talk to us about the benefits of proactive incident response planning for your managed customers. And for those unfamiliar with Pillr, Pillr is a powerful security operations software backed by 24/7 SOC services and support, including monitoring, alerting, and remediation support. And all Pillr customers have access to our pen testing and IR services. Our platform was developed by NovaCoast, a company with over 27 years experience in cybersecurity, including SOC services for some of the world's largest organizations. So without further delay, I'll pass it to Elise.
Thanks, Sia. I really appreciate it. And welcome everybody that's joined. We will do a Q&A at the end, but if you want to put anything into chat or questions in the meantime, feel free to do so. Let's get into it because we have plenty to cover today. So really the goals and takeaways for this session. The first one is how can you better prepare your clients? So I'm trying to give you some ways and things to be aware of when you are talking with your clients to make sure that they have all the things that they need to respond to a threat quickly and to start taking further actions. But we also want to make sure that you're prepared yourselves. So this might be either attacks that are directed at you as the MSP, but also to have that game plan so you can help your clients respond quickly to a threat. Let's talk a little bit about the problem out in the wild. So the average dwell time for an attacker is about 2 to 3 months. Average hot logs that your clients are going to have, if they have them, is about 3 months maybe. This dwell time, this is an average, so there's definitely groups out there that will compromise a network with it, and stay there for 6 months, or they might compromise it and then sell the access, and then somebody else comes back later. So a lot of times groups have visibility gaps. They just don't have either backups that are clean and old enough when they have a threat, or they don't have enough logs to figure out how somebody got into the network. The fastest turnaround we've ever seen is less than an hour. When it comes to phishing cases, I've actually seen this down as low as 15 minutes. So that's from initial compromise of the first patient zero user to when they pivot and they start spamming out everything to the global address book or other AD users. Now, the average cost in 2022, it was noted for small business, it was about $100K. I would say that's pretty consistent with what we've seen, stuff that's come through Pillr customers or referrals. But the average global amount that has been spent on incident response in 2022 was over $4 million. That's a really big range to do risk management on and prepare for. I think that's obviously why we're seeing a big uptick in cyber insurance. And I'll touch upon that a little bit because there's certain limitations that kind of come with that as well. So small businesses, which are probably the base of what most of your customers are, they are definitely the most vulnerable. So not only do they tend to have the fewest controls, they have the lowest amount of budget to be able to buy additional controls. They often don't have, if they don't have any IT staff, or they have IT staff, they may not have security staff. If they have security staff, they probably don't have IR, incident responders, and they have the most to lose. So a small business with a full ransomware attack with no backups that has to rebuild the entire environment, that can put them into bankruptcy or out of business. It's a massive issue when it comes to those small, mid-sized businesses. They often just don't have the cash on hand to even pay a ransom or to pay $100K for responders to come in and clean everything up and figure out what happened. So this is a huge space and a huge issue because more and more of these small businesses are being targeted, where for the most part, in the last 5 years, we normally think about enterprise when we think about cyber breaches. So let's talk about some of those low-hanging fruit things that you can provide to your customers and also take internally. So let's get rid of local admin everywhere. This is something that we see all the time. A lot of organizations have normal users with local admin, It makes it easier to facilitate stuff. Sure, they can install their own stuff. The downside is they can install their own stuff. That includes malware. That includes things like, TeamViewer that you might not want. That's, the result of a tech support scam. That could be all sorts of things. So if you can't application whitelist, get rid of local admin for normal users and create admin accounts for yourselves as well. Local admin in general is a problem unless you're doing something automated and you really require it. Make sure that you're protecting your own accounts. So you are a target as the MSP. You're going to have a lot of keys to the kingdom for your customers. So make sure that you're doing all of the same things. Sometimes it's hard as practitioners to drink your own Kool-Aid, so to speak, but you want to make sure that you have MFA anytime you're going into an environment, especially if you think it's compromised. You might want to reset that password when you come back out. So for example, if you're already peeing into a server and you discover that it is compromised, you're going to need to change your own creds in that case because it's possible they get captured on that endpoint. Make sure that you're always rotating service accounts at your customers and disable interactive login as much as humanly possible. This is a really common vector for how attackers will come in, particularly in the ransomware space. And then make sure a service account that's cached on a server that often has elevated permissions, and then they start just running rampant in the environment. And make sure that you're controlling your own management tools, whether you're using your own in-house built one or you're using like something like a ConnectWise or Screen Connect. This is basically a rat. So if you're not securing this with proper passwords, MFA, all those kinds of things that we like to talk about with remote access, you're basically giving a backdoor to an attacker that can scan that network. So things like TeamViewer, for example, TeamViewer is fine. It's a safe binary to install. But if you haven't secured that, it's easy to scan an environment and find those open TeamViewer ports, identify that it's there, and then try to come in through that vector. So we often see sometimes with a group that changed MSPs over time, they don't remove the old RMMs or remote administration tools from the environment before they put their own in. And so you end up with Ultra VNC and Screen Connect and TeamViewer on all in the same system. And those are all potentials that an attacker, once they get on there, they can weaponize it, or if it's running, that it can create a problem in that backdoor situation. So some other things that we see that are the most common. So as far as spreading malware goes, it's really your group policy and SMB network shares that's the most common. WIMI and PSExec and PowerShell, they can be all used to push payloads remotely as well. But I would say that these are the most common things, without getting too much onto living off the land or anything, that we see are weaponized the most into most environments. So if you kind of have to prioritize things that you're going to add controls to, this is a good place to start. And just remember that the most common ways to come in are to emails, which is kind of starts the attack from the inside of the house and makes it a lot more dangerous in most cases, but also exposed remote access. So that could be an insecure web application. It could be RDP that doesn't have MFA on it, or VPN that doesn't have MFA on it. That's going to be the most common way you're going to have groups come in. So you're going to want to make sure that you protect those types of connections. We want to standardize as much as possible, not only your own playbooks, but if you can get some standardization within your end customers, it's going to make it much easier to figure out what you need to do and what actions need to be taken up front in those environments. If you can kind of have some sort of structure in the way that you recommend your clients implement policies that you've been recommending. And of course, patch and update. I don't need to harp on this. That's just the best practice. So let's talk about some of the common pitfalls we see when we are taking on a case. And I'm bringing these up because if there are ways that you can capture this data or take care of these ahead for your customers, it's better to do it up front. Things like visibility gaps. Sometimes we inherit incidents where there wasn't already an endpoint solution on the devices, and they're only installing an EDR after the fact. Well, you lose a lot of visibility. Now I don't know what happened on the endpoint when the attacker was on there. Web server logs are a really good example. Any kind of web app, even something like Citrix, you're going to want to make sure that those are logged. They're noisy, they're expensive to store, they're expensive to put in the SIM. I understand that. Even if it's archiving it and compressing it a billion times and putting it somewhere else, having those web server logs, including Linux logs, you're going to thank yourself later for having that storage, because they roll over super quickly. And sometimes, especially if a web app is exploited, you're not going to have any evidence other than those web server logs that show you what happened. The Linux logs are most important because it's really easy for an attacker to remove evidence of what they did on a Linux box, much easier than Windows. Windows tends to store things in more places when you're doing forensics. And then of course, network and seeing how much data might have been exfiltrated, for example. We do find a lot of poor backup planning. So, it's great if you have your customers running Veeam or Datto or those kinds of things, but attackers know that those processes are running. So they will often disable the backup service running. And then they will also go out to the backup site, even if it's out in AWS or Azure or a different server or something, different data center. If they can get to that through the network, they will destroy those backups. It is absolutely important that you have cold backups, at least for the critical assets of your customers. I cannot stress this enough. If you don't, and those backups are destroyed, you go from, hey, we can probably fix this and contain it, to we have to rebuild every single system in the environment. Sometimes that it has to be a full rebuild. You can't restore if you don't have those backups. So things like the domain controllers, configs, your group policy, any kind of network configs that you have, those at minimum should be out there and backed up. And then make sure you're testing your backups. They're only as good as the testing, of course. We also see a lot of missing MFA. So like I mentioned, external facing resources, but also even on added accounts within the network. And then don't forget to do it on your own accounts. Again, that's kind of the taking your own advice component here. And we also see a lot of issues with complacency. So especially in the small business sector, people kind of subscribe to that idea of, well, I'm not that important, I won't get attacked. That's just not the case anymore. We just see so many different industries, so many different sizes of businesses getting attacked now. And it's easy when you kind of put in those best practice things that we've mentioned earlier, to think as the MSP that you're all set, the customers are good, you guys are the experts, and that's great. Yes, you are the experts, but it's also good to make sure that you're auditing your own work. So whether you're doing it yourself or you're working with a third party, I think third party gives a little cachet to your end customer, but it's all up to you. Make sure that you're actually testing these things, scanning, doing pen tests, do vulnerability scannings to make sure that those controls you put in are working effectively. So let's talk a little bit about the toolkit you can kind of have at your behest as an MSP to get the first level of response. You're going to want something that can do memory capture. This is the most volatile of evidence, and you're going to need something. I would recommend just having FTK on a USB drive and having that available to you just in case. You're going to want to capture that within the first hour or two, likely in an incident. Packet capture, being able to deploy Wireshark into an environment. If you have a tap device, even better, knowing where you would put a tap device if you needed to. All those kinds of things are good exercises. Have a malware lab, so if there are payloads that you need to investigate, being able to do that safely. Or you can have a plan. So if you have a sandbox, or you have a partner that has a sandbox or whatever, having a plan for handling those things so you can understand what that malware is doing so you can continue an investigation. Of course, scripts and automating artifact collection are great. A lot of EDRs have the ability to do this through either a remote shell or the API. There's tons of scripts out there in GitHub. Of course, evaluate your code before you use it. And if you're getting into the forensic space, you're going to need write blockers. You're going to need things that can make imagers, adapters for all the different devices and such. So there's a lot of different things depending on how deep you're going to go in providing these services to your customer. If you're doing it directly, that you're going to want to have in your toolkit. So let's talk a little bit about containment. So the first 24 hours are absolutely the roughest for a customer. Now, most commonly, you're going to have a containment within the first 72, I would say, roughly. But that containment action might be shutting down the entire business and the entire internet. So it can be very extreme as well. There's always this dance between we need to contain a system or we need to contain a section of the network, but we also need to get evidence. So maybe we have to report something to a regulator, for example, or maybe that containment action actually affects the quality of the evidence you have or might destroy the evidence that you have. So just be aware that if you're guiding a client through this kind of conversation, this is always going to be something you have to consider with every single step that you take, especially in the early times of, do I isolate this host or do I need the image first? The system needs to stay in production, but I also need evidence of what happened. Those kinds of pieces, that's the hardest part, I think, of the early stages of containment. Always have a plan. So that's usually endpoint isolation. If you can do that through an EDR, great. If not, you can shut off the network by disabling Wi-Fi. You can disable the NIC on a virtual appliance, whatever that might be. But typically, you're going to want to keep it powered on, turn off the network first, You're going to run an image, even if that's a VM snapshot, and then you can power off a system. That's the best path. You're going to want to have those playbooks written out for you guys in-house, just so it's easy to repeat them. Always make sure you have a quarantine VLAN, whether on the client's network. This is to move infected machines or machines that we're not sure about or restored backups that we need to monitor, putting them into a quarantine VLAN before they go back on the production network. And then also have kill switches. So that example of you might have to turn off the whole internet, you need to know how to do that way ahead. This is kind of that red button scenario, shut everything down. Having those processes for how communications happen, all those kinds of things are really important. So something else as the MSP, you want to think about what you're capable of doing in-house. Can you do malware analysis, both dynamic and static? Can you do forensics? Do you have a bunch of people that can do Windows forensics, but maybe they don't know Mac and Linux? Or you might not have the capabilities to do an iPhone, for example. If you have those skill gaps, either train up staff to fill those gaps, or of course find a partner or an entity that can help you with those functions. Somebody that can access threat intel networks, both looking up for things like leaked credentials, leaked data, intellectual property out on the web, those kinds of things, but also see what else other entities are seeing, kind of be able to ask questions around, figure out, is everybody else experiencing this threat? And when you're coming into ransomware, there's a lot of different things here, and this could be a whole talk by itself, but I'm just calling out two key things. One is you should always be aware that if you're just even thinking about paying a ransom, you need to make sure you're doing due diligence against OFAC. So this is a sanctions list. So there's quite a few ransomware groups and certain Bitcoin wallets and countries and such that are now we can't even pay a ransom to. General guidance from any partner, any law enforcement you're going to talk to is always going to tell you, no, don't pay the ransom first. But there are cases ransom needs to be paid, that due diligence step still needs to happen. It's actually, there's criminal implications to that. Negotiations are something else to be aware of. So some groups will just negotiate with the ransomware actor to buy time, but sometimes that it's required to get the ransom down. Be aware of who you're partnering with that. I recommend doing that through outside counsel to keep it privileged, but there are some ransomware negotiators out there that are a little less than, they kind of have some shady practices as the rumors go. So they might not share all the information with you because they're actually getting a cut of that ransom. If it's paid, it's an issue out there. And something when I talk about cyber insurance, make sure that any of these things that you're putting together in the plan are covered by your client's cyber insurance policy. Sometimes cyber insurance won't cover certain types of attacks. They won't cover it if there's certain kind of quote unquote negligent actions or things missing in the control group, or they might only funnel IR and forensics to certain teams, maybe in-house or external to them, and they might only be able to recommend and work with certain outside counsel. So be aware of those kinds of nuances and be familiar with your customers' policies. Apologize for the error here in the animation. So, whoops. My apologies, folks. So something in the incident response plans, whether you're building this in-house for your ability to respond and help your customers, or they're building their own IR plan internally, I'm covering just kind of some general things that should be in those IR plans. So you want to make sure that roles and responsibilities are clearly defined, who can declare an incident and under which conditions, who's allowed to interact with third parties, law enforcement, attorneys, et cetera. Kind of look at that list on the right. Who is the coordinator? So if you have multiple points of multiple teams, multiple companies that are responding to a breach, you're probably going to have a lead point person at the MSP. You're going to have a lead point person at the attorney's office. You're going to have one at maybe the IR partner, and you're going to have one on site at the client. So that's a lot of cooks in the kitchen. You're going to want to make sure that you're defining who is the commander over all of that, whether it's even a project manager that's just making sure everyone's doing what they need to. And then, of course, adjust for any special requirements. So, for example, a manufacturing customer, they might have certain needs around their operational technology environment that might require specific groups to help them, specific tools, or specific handling of that data. So that could also be if they have healthcare data or PCI data, those kinds of things. Who is responsible for those, if you have to find a privacy officer, et cetera. I won't go read through all this list, but anything when you're defining communications, you want to make sure that you have an out-of-band communication strategy. So if Microsoft 365 at the client, for example, is compromised, you should be able to take any verbal or email or documentation communications, either internal to you at the MSP or to whoever is doing the primary response, but then there's all these different pieces of reporting. Sometimes stuff leaks. Sometimes you have to talk to employees because they can't access their workstation. Customers need to be aware if they can't get onto a web portal. So there's a lot of different pieces of this puzzle, and it can grow and grow and grow. And so having people that can help you kind of coordinate all of this and all these different parties and who's doing what and following the attorney's instructions is incredibly important to lay out ahead of time. So for when you're talking about evidence preservation, I kind of mentioned this before, some things that you're going to want documented in an IR plan is the clear chain of custody and a copy of a chain of custody document. There's plenty of these generic ones out there, but this is for especially if something you think might go to litigation, like an insider threat or those kinds of things. You're going to want to make sure that you're maintaining chain of custody of all artifacts through the entire cycle of the investigation. And then you're also collecting evidence in the order of volatility. There's plenty of guides out there about that specifically. Where do you store this? How long do you store it for? And who can access it? Those are really important things, especially for attorneys. Oftentimes they need audit logs to determine that chain of custody hasn't been breached. So generally having a recovery plan. So if you were restoring, for example, a system from a backup, but you're not sure if that backup is clean, maybe it was taken within a window that the attacker was possibly in there. What you're going to want to do is put that in a quarantine VLAN. You're going to monitor it for a while, and then you can restore it into production. So that's usually the plan. You don't want to just throw a bunch of systems because you restored a backup back in the production network. That's an easy way to reinfect the network. Make sure you're going through the lessons learned activities. So that's both internal to you as the MSP. So talking through it with your teams, what could we do better? What other kinds of tools might we need to add to our toolkit, for example, for the next one that comes in? But also talking through this with your clients so they understand what their obligations are, what their plan might be or how they can prevent future cases like this happening, I think is really important. And also builds on your trust already with your end customers, and it helps embolden them to protect themselves because there's just too much out there for everyone to know everything. But the more educated your clients are, the less likely they are to be subject to something. And then of course, test your plan. So that might be usually tabletop exercises where you're talking through it with the customer. What would you do with this? What would you do with that? Or you're testing it internally with your own teams. So let's talk about what you can expect up ahead, I think, in the MSP world. So something you need to be aware of is MSPs are prime targets. Nation states will come after you. You might think that you're a 4-person shop or something, a 10, 20-person shop, and China's not going to want to come after you. That is completely not the case, especially if you have any high-profile customers, defense contractors, suppliers of defense contractors, those that do a lot of research and development, those kinds of things. They might come after you to try to get into your customers. You need to be especially diligent because you have those keys to the kingdom and increased access to your clients' environments. Something else MSPs are now experiencing, we saw it with Kaseya and SolarWinds and such, is supply chain attacks. So it's easy for this to happen, whether it's your own code being infected or tools that you're using and you're updating. This is something that's increasing over time. And I think MSPs are going to struggle to deal with that because there's often not capabilities to look through every application, every bit of code that's being used in your client environments. Something that, and I'm not in love with this term, but something that we're really seeing evolving in the landscape is what they're calling encryptionless ransomware. It's basically groups that go in, they steal a bunch of data, and then they ransom and extort the client for it, but they're not actually encrypting anything. There's more groups that are kind of coming around to this, and I think we're going to see this expand. And this is very problematic because it's basically you have 48 hours to determine if you're paying a ransom or not. And that data is automatically uploaded to the leak site of that ransom group. So BNLian and Ransom House are two ones that we've been seeing quite a bit of lately. So although it's nice, you don't have to worry about decrypting anything, you can guarantee that the data has already been stolen by the time you've gotten that ransom note. And it's very hard to track down what was taken and what is the risk of that data being public. And make sure you're having these discussions with your customers now. So that might be something tactical, quick things that you can pick off and make sure that they are protected from some of those common elements of attack, but also strategic. What's their long-term plan? What's their risk level? What's their attack surface look like? And going through and iterating through that so you can start adding controls where needed. And with that, I'll open this up for some Q&A. Caitlin or Sia, I don't know if we can open up audio too, but since we're kind of a small group, but if you want to just put questions into GoToWebinar, into chat, more than happy to do that.
Hey, Elise. Yeah, I gave everyone the controls to unmute themselves. So if they want to just unmute their mic and say it live, they can do that too.
Perfect, thank you. Does anybody have any questions or anything they want to dig into? I covered, that was a lot of information in a short amount of time, so I'm more than happy to discuss.
I was just wondering if we could get a copy of the deck.
Absolutely, happy to do that.
Great,
Yep.
thank you.
Yeah, no worries. This is my email address. If you just want to reach out to me on by email, I can send that over.
Thank you.
No worries. Anybody else have any questions or discussion points? Well, we got a couple of minutes here. All right. Well, my name and contact information is on this slide, so feel free to reach out to me if anybody else wants a copy of the deck, or if there's a way that we at Pillr can help you prepare for your customers and have those discussions about what you can do to help respond quicker, faster, and more efficiently when these incidents happen. I really appreciate everyone attending today, and I hope everyone has a great rest of your day. Thank you.